This is W.W. Chaplin. I'll be back in a moment with news of the world.
Today, Mr. Chaplin will be joined in this report on the news by NBC's veteran Washington reporter, Morgan Beatty. Since the Tokyo radio made its announcement early this morning, both Bill Chaplin and Morgan Beatty have been helping to cover the various developments on the surrender report. In the NBC newsrooms in this country and in our news centers all over the globe, all editors, reporters, and correspondents have been on the alert, and many times on the air. Here in the NBC newsroom in New York, our full staff is standing by in direct contact with Washington and with all points overseas. In addition to our regularly scheduled news programs, such as this daily report at 1:45 p.m. Eastern Wartime, NBC will call in its worldwide staff of correspondents whenever news developments warrant. Today, as always, we are concentrating upon the task of bringing our listeners the news, speedily and accurately. We suggest that you keep your radio tuned in to your local NBC station. And now, from the NBC newsroom in New York, here is W.W. Chaplin.
And here is a bulletin, the very latest development to come in. The International News Service has just reported from Stockholm that Sweden's government issued an official communique saying the Japanese surrender offer had been received by Sweden. It has been transmitted to the Allied governments. That is the very latest development. This is a day, of course, of wild speculation, of high hopes of reaching for a world peace, which seems at last to be no more than just beyond our fingertips. But here are the cold, hard facts as of right this minute. The war with Japan is not finished. We are still fighting Japan, on the ground, on and under the sea, and in the air. The war is not ended. Those are the facts up to this minute. Now for the story of the sensational developments of this morning, which makes it necessary to emphasize the fact that we are still at war, no matter how close peace may be. The Japanese radio suddenly blared to the world today the readiness of Nippon to accept the surrender terms listed in the recent Potsdam ultimatum, if. With the understanding is the way they phrase it, but what they mean is if. The Potsdam Declaration is not interpreted to lessen the power and position and prestige of Japanese Emperor Hirohito. Here's the exact way they phrase it. This is a translation into English from the Japanese, of course, but it's their own translation, so we may accept it as exact. Here's what they say. The Japanese government are ready to accept the terms enumerated in the joint declaration which was issued at Potsdam on July 26, 1945, by the heads of the government of the United States, Great Britain, and China, and later subscribed to by the Soviet government, with the understanding that the said declaration does not comprise any demand which prejudices the prerogatives of His Majesty as a sovereign ruler. And now we call in for another late report, NBC in Stockholm.
This is Sven Norberg speaking from Stockholm. There is, as yet, very little information about the latest startling news available for the time here in Stockholm. But the Swedish Foreign Office has confirmed that a note from the Japanese government was handed over to the Allies today. A spokesman of the Foreign Office tells me that at 12 o'clock Swedish time, that is 7 hours ago, the envoyé extraordinaire et ministre plénipotentiaire of Japan in Stockholm, Mr. Suemasa Okamoto, was received at the Foreign Office by the new Swedish Minister of Foreign Affairs, Mr. Östen Undén. Mr. Okamoto handed over a note and asked Mr. Undén to forward it to the representatives of the British and Soviet governments here in Stockholm. The British and Russian ministers were immediately sent for and received the Japanese note from Mr. Undén. That is all the spokesman of the Swedish Foreign Office can confirm. But he adds that it is most likely that a similar ceremony has taken place in Switzerland today, where a note was handed over to the American and Chinese ministers. So far, the Swedish Foreign Office. And that seems to be all information available here. I have called delegations of the United States, of Switzerland, of Russia, and of Japan. Everywhere the answer is, we can make no comments on the present situation. The only reaction noticeable here in Stockholm is one of tense expectation. The posters of the evening papers here all say peace in letters 10 inches high. But if one looks closely, the careful reader discovers a little question mark after that word. So I return you now to the NBC newsrooms in New York.
This is W.W. Chaplin in New York again. You just heard NBC in Stockholm telling us that the Japanese surrender offer has now been placed in the hands of our representative there. I told you before we heard from Stockholm what the Japanese conditions are to accepting our demand for unconditional surrender. Whether we will accept such an offer, such conditions, the next few hours should tell. President Truman's cabinet is right now gathering at the White House. But for the moment, we have not accepted. We are still at war with Japan. Up to this moment, Russia is the only one of the big four which has actually received at its capital the Japanese Qualified Surrender offer officially. When Russia declared war against Japan day before yesterday, Japan must have already had this offer in mind because they did not clap the Soviet ambassador into custody, as is the custom. They kept him in circulation so they could use him today. And this morning, he was officially handed the Japanese conditional surrender note for direct transmission to Moscow. We and the British and China, of course, have no diplomatic representatives at Tokyo, and so it was announced that we would be informed through Sweden, which, as you have just heard from Stockholm, that note has now been passed. Those relayed offers, so far as we know, have not come through yet to Washington, and of course no official action will be taken until they do. But we know what the Jap offer is, both from the Tokyo radio report and from the text of the official note to Moscow, which unquestionably is a copy of what we are to get. So the international telephone lines were buzzing today between the White House and the Kremlin and 10 Downing Street. The Allied leaders are, in effect, have been holding a Big Four conference by remote control, a conference such as never was, because on its outcome depends whether we are at last going to call an end to war all over the world right now, or whether we must still fight on to get a peace without any strings attached to it at all. Popular reaction to the Jap offer has been mixed. There was a big GI celebration on Okinawa. Crowds thronged the streets in London, even more jubilant than they were on VE Day. In Chongqing, crowds jammed the streets, clapping their hands and popping firecrackers. In Washington, people gathered along the fence surrounding the White House, and a special guard was posted. In Moscow, the Russians seemed to take it in their stride, the possible sudden end of their 2-day war with Japan. And here in New York, we must be as hard to excite as the Russians. So far, I haven't seen one bit of paper come twisting down in celebration from the skyscrapers. And now, I want to bring to this program a man who was with President Truman at Potsdam. He was there when the ultimatum was issued. He returned with him on the cruiser Augusta and is now in Washington. He was representing all 4 major American radio networks at the Potsdam Conference. So here, to give you a picture of the present situation from his special vantage point, is NBC's Morgan Beatty.
Thank you, Bill Chaplin. And I might add that all of your colleagues on the Berlin front, the veterans of Normandy and the surrender in Europe, send you their best regards, and they wish you were there with them. Everybody's interested today in the Japanese surrender terms, and I'd like to stress what you have already pointed out. Widespread use of the word official today by government spokesmen in several world capitals. Charlie Ross, the President's secretary, says that the President has no official word. The Swedish Foreign Office now has official word, and so on. There is behind this the implied meaning that unofficial word has been passing among the warring powers, as you've already pointed out. And behind the vacuum in news lies the real story of events, a story we're not going to get right away, and we might as well be patient about it. Today I can report to you, however, why we're not going to get that story right away. Beneath every other reason lies the fundamental fact. There is no basis in any Allied capital for mutual trust in any degree of the Japanese. Every last piece of business we do will have to be checked and rechecked. The important thing to remember at this time is that no peace with the Japanese can come until the surrender talk has reached a military decision, and that decision has been tested in the field by military and naval commanders in touch with each other. So far, not one word pertaining to military decision has been spoken in any of the big 3 capitals, which means the talk is still on a high plane, a diplomatic plane, and it can't mean much until it gets down to the gun-firing men on battlefronts, who so far have no order to cease firing so far as we know. There was a lot about Sweden in your broadcast, and Stockholm itself came up, NBC in Stockholm. Maybe I can throw some light on this here in Washington. First, Sweden is the only official contact of all the Allied nations, the only capital of a neutral in this world where all Allied powers are represented. That is not true of Switzerland, even though the Jap is trying to get and use Switzerland to get in touch with us and the Chinese. Official contact and confirmation takes time. The Swiss began to handle Japanese affairs only recently, and they must familiarize themselves with codes and channels. We use the American legation at Bern to get in touch with Tokyo. The Japanese use the Swiss legation in Washington to get in touch with us. It is far more likely that the real trading for Japanese surrender is being done through the Moscow ambassador in Tokyo and then through the ministerial corps in Sweden for this reason. Contact is by instantaneous wireless telephone between Stockholm and Tokyo and Moscow and Tokyo. All the big powers are represented in Stockholm. They are not in Bern. And what's more important, the American, British, and Russian governments have far more confidence in the teamwork among their ministers in Stockholm and the Swedes than they have in any other neutral capital in the world. This team transmitted the unofficial talks that ended the war in Germany. They know how to work together smoothly. Furthermore, the Swedes undertake humanitarian work of this kind with a degree of courage that has not always been displayed elsewhere. They are willing to break protocol, formalities, at the risk of the displeasure of great powers. They are willing to put their personal safety in jeopardy if necessary to achieve peace. That has been shown several times during this war. But even so, the talk back and forth on a purely unofficial plane takes time. Then there's the matter of military commanders in the field, the Japanese troops in New Guinea, in the Philippines, in China, Manchuria, and in the home islands. What about them? Will they accept the orders of the Japanese government? We have no proof as yet that they will. It is true that military commanders of opposing armies can get in touch with each other by radio and do much oftener and more quickly than they have in past wars to arrange temporary truces and so on. But in this case, the troops are scattered all over Asia and Asiatic island areas. If an agreement should be reached on a high level, every commitment by the Japanese will have to be tested in the field. White airplanes, perhaps, will have to fly over certain spots at certain times with certain messages, or something similar will have to be arranged to test out whether Tokyo speaks for all Japanese. Then there's the matter of 135,000 American and European nationals now in the custody of the Japanese. Their safety must be guaranteed in some way. They must continue to get food, and we must have a guarantee to that effect. All of these details take time. And we on the sidelines do not yet have the key to the time element. By that I mean we do not know how long the three powers on the highest level have been talking with a trusted third party, if they have been doing that. We don't know what has been said, whether surrender conditions are actually being worked out or whether there are major points still to be decided. The only light I can throw on that point is this. On our way back from the Berlin conference, I am quite certain President Truman thought there was a definite chance for the atomic bomb to end the war. Somehow I felt that he must have more reasons for thinking that way than the atomic bomb itself or even Russia's entry into the struggle. And now, Bill, one last-minute bulletin dated London by the Associated Press. The Stockholm radio confirms tonight that Japan has handed the Swedish Minister of Foreign Affairs a note to the British, American, and Russian governments offering to surrender. And now, Bill Chaplin will be back with you again Monday at this same time.
During the past quarter hour, as part of NBC's extensive coverage of the news, we have presented W. Chaplin, Morgan Beatty, and Sven Norberg. During the preceding hours, NBC listeners today have heard many special broadcasts on the report that the Japs were preparing to surrender. We've given our listeners such distinguished commentators as H.V. Kaltenborn, Robert St. John, Caesar Searchinger, Henry Cassidy, and many others. And today, too, NBC took its listeners to London, Paris, Manila, Guam, Honolulu, and many other points for historic sidelights and reactions to the news. Thus, NBC is ever alert to serve its listeners with complete news coverage. And not only that, but NBC provides its listeners with top-quality entertainment. And while entertainment is on the air, listeners have another advantage on NBC. They can be sure that when any big news breaks, NBC will give it to them promptly. W. Chaplin is heard each weekday at the same time, Monday through Friday, over the network stations of the National Broadcasting Company.